Hey people, welcome back. I'm Indypride from Milk and Cookies Total War, and today we'll be covering another legendary Lord character I expect to see in Total War Warhammer 2. This video will address one specific Lord, their background lore, and their possible implementation in the second game of the trilogy. Now for the High Elves, we already know beyond a shadow of a doubt who the first two named characters will be. The blood of Anarion flows in both their veins. They are the preeminent mage and general of the Asur, and they are the twin brothers Tyrion and Teclis. Teclis was shown off in the announcement trailer, and Tyrion is on the Steam page, so we know they're in. But there will for sure be other named characters that drop in as legendary lords after launch, either as free content or in lord packs. Now the High Elves of Ulthuan, love them or hate them, are one of the most anticipated races in the Total War Warhammer trilogy. And when you learn about their roster and their lore, it honestly makes a lot of sense. On paper, they're super overpowered. Their home continent is the breeding ground of the most powerful creature in Warhammer Fantasy, the Star Dragon. The Chosen of Azurian are amongst the finest infantry in history. Their command of the winds of magic is far superior to most other races. Their best archers rival the marksmanship of the greatest Azrai Glade Lords and Way Watchers, and along with the Lizardmen, they are the people responsible for kicking the first gigantic Chaos incursion back into the Warp. Their armies are disciplined and orderly like the piked phalanxes of Macedon, with a wide assortment of elite heavy cavalry, archers, spearmen, swordsmen, and monsters from phoenixes to griffins and dragons. So they have a lot going for them. Now the Dawi might not agree with that assessment. They'd probably remind the Knife Ears how the War of Vengeance went, but without question, the Asur are amongst the mightiest military factions on the planet. But there was a time, before the War of the Beard, where the Elves were the unquestioned masters of the world, before their armies were bled in two gigantic wars. A time when they ruled their home continent and colonized from Lustria to the Old World. And then came the Sundering, which I've talked about in my Wood Elf and Dark Elf lore videos, and which I'll pretty much be forced to cover again when I do my High Elf lore, army, and tactics video as well. So just a quick refresher on that front. Malekith thought Belshazzar, the current Phoenix King at the time, was a huge pussy, and he was probably right on that front. He felt like he should be king as he was the son of Anarion the Defender, so he poisoned Belshazzar and triggered a gigantic civil war that ultimately resulted in a climactic battle at the site of the Great Vortex on the Isle of the Dead. Behind him rose the people of Nagarath, who had grown ever more bloodthirsty and warlike after Anarion drew the Sword of Cain. Their fight for control of the Vortex, which is what we're going to be going and fighting over in Game 2, resulted in the Sundering, splitting Ulthuan and sinking parts of the northern kingdoms, while the mages and dreadlords of Nagarath lifted their own cities from the very earth with the overflow of magical energy, sailing away from Ulthuan forever and establishing a new land on the continent of Nagaroth. But when the Elves of Nagarath rebelled in support of Malekith and became the Dark Elves, there were those who stayed loyal to the High Elves. They witnessed the rapacity, the blood greed, and the kinslaying that characterized the Dark Elf Rebellion, and swore to wage eternal war against the Drukai for all they had done. Thus, they became known as the Shadow Warriors, and Nagarath became known as the Shadowlands. And this is where Alith Anar, the Shadow King, enters the story. The son of one of Nagarath's most noble households, after the Sundering, his family immediately declared their loyalty to the Asur. As the rebellion had originated in Nagarath, they were on the front lines and immediately engulfed in the first battles of the war. At the Battle of Dark Fen, his father was ravaged by a Dreadlord's Black Dragon, his grandfather was taken into the dungeons of Anlek and never seen again, and many of his people were slain on that fateful day. They were isolated, outnumbered, and reinforcements from Illyrion and Trace, the two closest kingdoms to Nagarath, would have never made it to the field in large enough numbers to tilt the balance in time. So Alith Anar retreated into the countryside, waging a guerrilla war with the sole purpose of purging the kingdom of Dark Elf influence. He led brutal ambush after brutal ambush, disrupted supply chains, assassinated important figureheads, and his legend began to grow. Now, as we know, birds of a feather flock together, and every single Shadow Warrior had lost someone important to them in the opening stages of the war. So when word spread of his achievements at the Battle of Illyrion Plains, where he had led a small band into the Drukai rear guard and slaughtered the Reaper bolt thrower crews, turning the tide, these Shadow Warriors swarmed to Alith Anar's side, swelling his ranks and giving him a truly potent force of guerrilla warriors at his beck and call. At this point, he had gained a huge amount of notoriety in a very short amount of time, and dreadlords were beginning to fear his name. Even Malekith the Witch King was wary about any military action in the ruins of Nagarath without a huge show of force, because patrols and even small armies were just not cutting it. Every time raiding parties landed in the kingdom, or Dark Riders who had remained behind when the Black Arks left for the new continent rode out in force, they were caught in feints and traps and slaughtered in a manner that would have made Genghis Khan proud. The Shadow King knew he couldn't beat ranks upon ranks of executioners and dreadspears and Cold One cavalry in open battle, so he avoided it, succeeding spectacularly in a guerrilla tactic war that completely minimized casualties for his own troops while slowly gnawing at the sanity and cohesion of those enemies unfortunate enough to be stuck in the Shadowlands. But his most infamous moment came at the Battle of Griffin Pass, where he captured 700 Dark Elves and had them nailed high upon the White Cliffs overlooking the valley. They were granted a traitor's burial, which meant none whatsoever. They hung until they died, while carrion birds picked at their eyes and ears, and insects swarmed their decaying bodies. Their corpses remained for years afterwards, until their bones finally fell, where they can still be seen thousands of years later, along with the red marks left by Alith Anar's iron nails upon the cliffs. This was a warning. But he didn't stop there. Over the following centuries and millennia, he led many raids north to the new continent of Nagarath, harassing Malekith's ships, ambushing his warriors, plundering his convoys, and generally causing mayhem in the land of Chill. The Shadow King was so badass, he snuck into Malekith's own court, disguised as a Drukai lord, and danced with Morathi, cop in a field, stealing her Stone of Midnight, a gift to her from Anarion, and dipping out before anyone realized what he had done. Keep in mind, Morathi is the #1 Dark Elf mage, who would have completely eviscerated him in the blink of an eye if she had suspected it was him, but she didn't. So for him to even dare something like that, to get his grind on with one of the most beautiful and evil ladies in Warhammer with a crazy wrathful streak, and steal one of her most prized possessions at the same time, makes you wonder how he even sits down with those gigantic testicles. I mean, the guy even managed to poison all of the witch elves who chased after him once the hag sorceress realized what had occurred and sent the might of the Temple of Cain hot on his heels. He still got away scot-free. There's a really great quote here from Shadow King, A Tale of the Sundering, that I think perfectly sums up Alith Anar and the Shadow Warriors. Tainted by association with the Witch King and the violent madness of Anarion, the survivors of Nagarath are a very different type of Asur. Since the destruction of their lands, they have been a rootless and nomadic people, drawn to fighting and unable to settle to more peaceful tasks. They are intense and brooding, proud and warlike, and this has made them little trusted by the other elves of Ulthuan. Despite this, they are amongst the most loyal subjects of the Phoenix King, and the tales of their daring exploits are many. It is an unusual elf indeed who has not heard of their valor. Though they are wilder and perhaps more vicious than the rest of our people, it is because of their tragic past rather than innate cruelty. Given the bitter times through which they have lived, this is a flaw that we find easy to forgive and forget, recounted by the Herald of the Phoenix King. So I think it's important to understand that the Shadow Warriors were also in part cursed when Anarion drew the Sword of Cain. So they are certainly more bloody and more ruthless than their brothers to the east and south, but a big part of this whole saga is their desire for vengeance, to make the Drukai pay for all the bloodshed and kinslaying they caused in the opening stages of the war. And as it should be pretty clear to you by now, they do a pretty damn good job of that. And detractors of the High Elves, they might say they're too arrogant, they're too prissy, they're too afraid to get their hands dirty to fulfill the role of world police. But after learning about the Shadow King, I think it's kind of hard to make those lines of thought stick. Alith Anar is a straight up badass, elf or not. But unlike Thankwall, he is not an incredibly popular character, although he certainly does play a large role in the Sundering and High Elf lore in general. He's only been a main or point of view character in a handful of novels. But what he does offer is a gameplay style that is entirely different from Tyrion or Teclis or Ilariel the Everqueen. An armor-piercing, death-from-afar range character that can take down enemy lords and heroes better than any generic Glade Lord or Way Stalker. In terms of DLC, I think the Everqueen might take precedent over him because she's literally the Queen of the Elves and could certainly have a Lord pack in which she is pitted against Crone Hellebron and the Temple of Cain, and she certainly deserves her own lore video or to be covered in detail in High Elves lore, army, and tactics whenever that gets done. But I think the Shadow King offers a more unique gameplay experience and might be a more interesting choice than Alith the Grim, who, while also a very important character, wouldn't play much differently than Tyrion besides the fact that he has a griffin mount named Stormwing. That's why I focused on the Shadow King and the Shadow Warriors for this second video. So what kind of equipment and legendary items would Alith Anar bring to campaign and the battlefield? How would he be implemented in Total War Warhammer? Well, obviously he would have significant buffs to movement range, ambush chance, and marksmanship for his Shadow Warriors. Shadow Warriors would have cheaper upkeep and be cheaper to recruit, and his redline army buffs would focus on shooting and armor-piercing damage. In contrast to someone like Prince Tyrion, who would have a lot of melee and cavalry-focused army buffs, Alith Anar would provide bonuses to more of the range units and improving their mobility, as well as shooting and skirmishing that will play a very large part in his army cores. As I mentioned earlier, he personally stole Morathi's Stone of Midnight, a powerful jewel that cloaks the wearer in shadow. This gives him a ward save and severely lowers the accuracy of any enemy attempting to shoot him from range, and this could give him an active ability in Total War Warhammer that reduces enemy accuracy or range, kind of like Night Shroud from the lore of the Little Wa, or it could just be a passive 40-meter area of effect ward save. The Shadow Crown is his second magical item, a symbol of his rightful rule of Nagarife that allows him to freeze time for the blink of an eye, allowing him to slip away from harm in the lore. In the tabletop, this gives him the Swift Stride special rule, which in Total War Warhammer terms will likely mean he has no movement or speed penalties moving through forest or rough terrain, and a fast movement speed for a dismounted lord. This is one of my issues with lord implementation in the first game in general. Vampires and elves should be significantly faster than dismounted dwarf or empire lords, for example, but at least in the case of Vlad and Manfred, for example, they're incredibly slow on foot, so hopefully Alith Anar and other dismounted elven lords are buffed in the speed category at the very least. I can't remember off the top of my head whether Glade Lords or Waystalkers got the speed demon treatment or not in Total War Warhammer, but anyway, for the base game, not counting the DLC stuff, I know that vampires should be absolutely way faster than regular dwarf and empire lords in general. Anyway, Alith Anar should be very fast on foot. His final quest item is an exquisite bow gifted by Lilith the Maiden herself, which is effectively a bolt thrower that does tremendous armor-piercing damage. In fact, armor saves are not permitted against wounds caused by this bow in the tabletop, so it should be fantastic for cutting through heavily armored lords and hero characters, and actually it might be able to kill multiple models and skewer them in a single shot, unlike the Glade Lord's bows, which typically in Total War Warhammer only kill a single model when they hit. Interestingly enough, it also causes a severe leadership penalty against Dark Elf units, so I'll be very interested to see if that is implemented specifically as a counter to the Dark Elves, or if it's given a generic fear penalty that applies to all enemy armies. On the one hand, it'd be really cool to see it as a lore implementation against the Dark Elves specifically. On the other hand, it would make him a lot more viable and better in general if he's able to cause fear to pretty much any unit that he shoots at. Ultimately, I think Alith Anar, the Shadow King, will provide the High Elves with a very unique campaign starting in the north of Ulthuan in the Shadowlands with a very fun playstyle that revolves around ambushing and shooting and skirmishing, and his lore and abilities make him perfect for Legendary Lord status. Hope you guys enjoyed this look into the character and how he might translate into Total War Warhammer 2, and of course over the next weeks and months I will be doing more Legendary Lord videos for the characters I expect to see in Total War Warhammer 2. Again, I have a pretty good suggestion or an idea of what unannounced characters will be coming soon, but if you have any ideas, feel free to let me know in the comment section below. Look forward to seeing those. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Indypride, signing out for now.